I've been wrestling with purpose. What was I created for? I'm more than what you see on the surface. See beneath my skin and scars, I'm skinned and scarred. Marred and twisted, scarred by the past I need to be lifted. And sometimes I question my own existence. What was I put here for? In my seams, it seems that there seems to be more. It's like I'm a light, unplugged from the socket. I mean, do I really exist to put money in my pocket? This 9 to 5 feels like a 9 to 9. My mind entwined, I pass the time, life circles me as I wait. What is my estate? I feel like I was made for something great, and yet I can't quite put my finger on it. But when I look at my fingers and I see their design, I realize I'm one of a kind, and something created me. No, someone created me, and that someone made me for a reason. Even though it's clear the past years have been treason, I still sense this drawing, this calling, that even in the midst of my falling, there was someone who died to pick me up, someone who rose to fix me up, someone who's coming back to lift me up. And that someone is Jesus. See, God made me for a purpose, and when I delight in Him, it's brought to the surface.
Well, good morning, and just want to say a special thanks to Reverend Jen Graffius for sharing last week. I was in beautiful Olathe, Kansas, moving my stepson into his college apartment as he starts his sophomore year at Mid-America Nazarene University, and just a little advice, don't visit Olathe, Kansas in August. It was very hot and very humid, but I'm glad to be back with you today. I'll never forget the first time I let my youngest son belay me at the climbing gym. So if you're unfamiliar, in climbing, the person belaying is the person who holds the rope while the other person is climbing, so the rope will catch them if they fall, or in my case, when they fall. The belayer is also the person who slowly lowers the climber back down to the ground using the rope after they reach the top. So a belayer literally has a climber's life in their hands, which is why climbers are generally a little choosy about who they let belay them. And when my youngest son was 12 years old, I decided that it was time for him to start belaying me, mostly because I was tired of not being able to climb when we were together. He was getting all the climbing, and I was getting all the belay duty. So we decided, 12 years old. Now, our weight difference was so significant that he had to anchor himself into a 50-pound sandbag at the climbing gym so the rope didn't cause him to shoot up in the air if I fell. So this picture is actually from a couple of years ago of my son belaying me at Mount Rubidoux in Riverside. And he was 19 when this picture was taken. But the very first time in the gym I let him belay me, he was 12 years old. And it was strange as my 12-year-old son held my life in his hands. I had a similar experience when I took my oldest son for a college visit to Cal State Monterey Bay when he was a senior in high school. He was 17 years old at the time. He'd had his driver's license for less than a year. And we decided to take the scenic route. But when we reached San Simeon, going up Pacific Coast Highway, I said, okay, we're trading places. And he drove the rest of the way up PCH, up to Monterey. And if you've ever driven that stretch of highway from San Simeon up to Monterey, you know that it can be a treacherous drive. And so having your teenage driver drive you, it raises your anxiety level a little bit. But it's a strange transition in life when we start trusting our lives to the very ones who've spent their lives trusting us. As Christians, we talk a lot about trusting God. But this morning, I want to talk about God trusting us. And to explore this idea, we're going to look at a story that Jesus told during his ministry about trust out of Matthew chapter 25. So I'm going to invite you, if you're able, if you would stand with me for the reading of the words of Jesus today from Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Jesus said, "Again, it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more.' His master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' The man with 2 bags of gold also came. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more.' His master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. 'Master,' he said, 'I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you.' His master replied, 'You wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" You can be seated. Jesus begins this story by describing a wealthy man who prepares to leave on a long journey. Before leaving on his journey, this wealthy man entrusts all of his wealth to 3 of his servants. Now, the NIV translation that I read from uses the phrase bags of gold to describe the master's wealth. But most English translations translate this word talents. 5 talents, 3 talents, and 1 talent. The man entrusts each of his 9 talents to his 3 servants, each according to their ability. Now, in our English language, the word talent means skills or abilities. Someone might have a talent like juggling or playing shuffleboard, or the show America's Got Talent showcases people's special skills or abilities. But the Greek word that's used here for talent was actually a form of currency. In fact, back then, a talent was the highest form of currency that existed in the Greco-Roman world, which is why the NIV translates it bags of gold. A single talent was roughly the equivalent of about $300,000 in the modern dollar. So this is really an unexpected twist in this story, that this wealthy man would entrust all of his wealth to his servants, not to his children, not to his business partners, not to a broker or a banker, but to 3 of his servants. To the first servant, he entrusts $1.5 million. To the second, $900,000. And to the third, $300,000. And then this wealthy man leaves on this journey. While he's away on his journey, the first 2 servants double their master's money. But the third servant buries the master's money in the ground. And before you're too hard on the third servant, back then people believed that burying money was actually the safest way to protect money. The people hearing Jesus tell this story would have immediately considered the third servant to be the most prudent and careful of the three. Finally, after a long time, this wealthy master returns from his journey and calls his three servants to settle accounts. The first two servants present their earnings to the master, and they're commended. "Well done, good and faithful servant," he says to each of the first two servants. He puts them in charge of even more, and he invites them to share in his own joy. But when the third servant presents his one talent to the master condemns him. And that's really the second twist in this story, that the master condemns the servant who is the most prudent of the three. The third servant saw the master as harsh, unreasonable, and unrelenting, and out of fear of what would happen to him if he lost that one talent, he played it safe. So the master takes away the one talent from the third servant and gives it to the first servant. And then the third servant is cast out of the household. Jesus told this story to teach us that God trusts us. In church, we're used to talking about and singing about us trusting God. We trust God for our salvation. We trust God to provide for our needs. We trust God to lead us and guide us in life. And these are all very important. But here in this story, we find the idea that God trusts us, which is a pretty crazy idea when you think about it. That the creator of the galaxies would trust part of his creation with what belongs to him. And so let's consider 4 different ways that God trusts us from this story that Jesus told. So first, God trusts us by sharing his resources with us. God shares his resources that belong to him with us. Just as the wealthy man in the story gave each of his servants a different allotment of resources, God entrusts us as his children with different allotments of God's resources. And the closest application of this parable is our finances. As Christians, we believe that all of our financial resources ultimately belong to God, and God brings those resources into our life as a gift of grace. Just as all the talents in this story belong to the master, all of our resources ultimately belong to God. And God entrusts and gives allotments of resources to us as a gift of grace, which cuts against the idea that we have in our culture that we earn everything that we get. See, all of our finances, all of our opportunities to make money, all of the gifts that we have that people value, all of those ultimately come from God. Our capacity to work come from God and are given as a gift of grace. And like each of the 3 servants received a different allotment, God trusts different Christians with different allotments of his resources. Some Christians are like the 5-talent servant in the story. These are Christians that God has entrusted a lot of financial resources to. And God expects 5-talent Christians to acknowledge that all of those resources come from God as a gift of grace. And God expects 5-talent Christians to use what they've been given, because to whom much is given, much is required, Jesus said. But most of us, when we read this story, see ourselves more as like the 2-talent servant, because we're surrounded with people who have more than us and who have less than us. Most of us in our culture read this story locating ourselves somewhere in the middle. And I suppose which servant we identify with in the story really depends a lot on where we live. The Christians in Haiti or in Ethiopia would probably view all of us as 5-talent servants. But when we hear this story in our culture, in our economy, most of us see ourselves as somewhere in the middle, more like the 2-talent servant. And the biggest temptation 2-talent servants face is comparing themselves to 5-talent servants. Because we see people who have more than us, it's easy for us to feel inadequate. And to think, if only I had the resources that person had, to imagine all the things that we would do to be faithful to God. But God expects 2-talent servants to be just as faithful as 5-talent servants. And still others are more like the 1-talent servant. And that 1-talent servant gets a bad rap because they were unfaithful with what was trusted to them. But they had the opportunity to be just as faithful as the 2-talent servant and the other servant. No matter how little a Christian has, what that person has is entrusted to them by God and given as a gift of grace. Jesus once praised a widow for her generosity in the offering in the temple for giving just 2 cents as an act of worship. And so, like the wealthy landowner in the story, God trusts His resources to us as His children. And He gives us different allotments. And I do think we can legitimately apply this story to more than just our finances. Even though it's primarily a story about money, it's not a stretch to apply it to our other resources, to our possessions and our abilities, our homes, our opportunities, our education. You see, part of discipleship as a follower of Jesus is coming to a point in our lives where we recognize that all that we have belongs to God. And Jesus told this story in part to help us see this. And this is a deeply countercultural way to live in our world today. That what I have does not belong to me, but belongs to God. It's as if our money shouldn't be stamped with the phrase, "In God we trust," but it should be stamped with the phrase, "In me God trusts." It's as if all of my possessions should be stamped, "In me God has trusted this." My education, my clothes, my opportunities, my savings account, my ordination as a pastor, everything. Christians have a word for it, and the word is stewardship. See, stewardship is not primarily about fundraising or charitable giving or philanthropic work. Stewardship is about countercultural discipleship, where followers of Jesus live their lives recognizing that Jesus is Lord over everything they have, that everything is a trust. God trusts us with His resources. There's a second way God trusts us in this story. God trusts us by expecting us to use His resources to advance His priorities. Now, in the parable, the master's priority was making more money, as much money as possible. And the master in the story expected his 3 servants to put his priority ahead of their own priorities, which is why he condemned the 3rd servant who didn't put the master's priorities first. But you know, God's priority is not making more money. God doesn't need our money. God's priority is people. If you're a follower of Jesus, God expects us to use the resources that He has trusted us to advance what's important to Him in the lives of people. He expects us to use our money and our education and our jobs and our abilities and our possessions and our opportunities, all that we have, to advance what's important to His heart. And that, of course, doesn't mean that we neglect our kids or that we neglect our aging parents or that we don't pay our bills or that we fail to plan for retirement. Those things are all important and they all fit within God's priorities. But God's priorities are bigger than just taking care of ourselves and our families. All that we have is to be used to advance God's purposes. The third way God trusts us in this story is God trusts us by holding us accountable for how we use the resources that He's trusted to us, by holding us accountable. Just as the master eventually returned and settled accounts with all three servants, the Bible teaches that one day Jesus will return again to this earth, and He will hold all of His children accountable for how we've managed what was trusted to us. And I find it comforting in this story that the master didn't expect the 2-talent servant to do as much as the 5-talent servant. That he didn't expect the 1-talent servant to do as much as the 2-talent servant. He doesn't hold us accountable for what we don't have. He holds us accountable for what we do with what we do have. And one day each of us will stand before God and give an account. And unlike the master of this story, God isn't expecting us to have doubled our money. He's expecting us to have translated what He trusted us into impact in the lives of people. God expects us to use what He's trusted us with to reach people for Jesus, to impact children and families, to help Christians grow in their spiritual formation, to feed the hungry, to heal the broken, to share Christ with the nations, to give hope to the hopeless. And I suspect that there will be some Christians on that day that are embarrassed by how they've used what was trusted to them, because some Christians bury what God trusts to them. Some Christians use what God trusts them for their own priorities and don't know about or don't recognize God's priorities. And some of us tend to forget who owns what we have. Now, I think it's reading far too much into this parable to suggest that 1-talent Christians don't make it into heaven. I think the point of the parable is that we will be accountable for what God trusts us with. Finally, the fourth way God trusts us in this story is by joyfully rewarding us when we use His resources faithfully. The master commends the first 2 servants. Well done, good and faithful servant. How we long to hear those words. The master rewards them with increased responsibilities. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. The master invites them to share his joy. Enter into your master's happiness. See, God not only holds us accountable for how we use what He trusts to us, but He rewards us when we do it well and when we do it faithfully. He commends us for our faithfulness. He gives us increased responsibilities, more resources to steward, both in this life and in the next. And He invites us to share in His joy. That deep experience of the joy of God that He experiences in the triune God, He invites us into that joy. And this isn't to say that we should live for the reward, but if we love God, we'll want our decisions to bring Him delight and to experience that delight ourselves. This story is all about trust. God trusts us by giving us of His resources as a gift, different apportions, each person. By expecting us to manage those resources to advance His priorities, what's important to Him. By holding us accountable for how we use the resources He trusts us with, and then by rewarding us when we do it well. My friends, this is a countercultural way to live in our world today. It is living our lives by a completely different script than what our culture offers us today. Back in 2005, I helped coach my third son's Little League baseball team. In all, with the 4 Peck boys, I spent 10 years in Upland American Little League Baseball. Those were very long years, some of them. But the 2005 season with my third son was by far the most memorable. We started the season with 14 kids between the ages 9 and 11 years old. A few were already good ball players, a few had never played baseball before, and most were somewhere in the middle. But something magical happened that season. We ended up going undefeated on the season, 21 wins and no losses, including sweeping the playoffs. And although we had a few very good players, it was really a different kid each game that made the difference in the win. Some couldn't pitch, but they could field. Some struggled to hit all season long, but they could get a walk and steal a base. It was like the parable of the talents happening in baseball with little kids, with each player representing a different level of skill, but each using whatever it was that they brought to the table for the common good and the rest of the team. I admit it was a lot of fun going undefeated. I still have one of the game balls from one of the playoff games. But what was even more gratifying that season was knowing that every kid on that team, all 14 of them, no matter how good or bad at baseball they were, truly believed that the team was undefeated because of something that they contributed during the season. And I think that's how God wants us to feel on that final day. That each of us contributed what we had to God's amazing victory. Not that we compared ourselves to people who had more than we did, and not that we judged people who had less, and certainly not that we buried what God had given us because we were afraid, but that we used what we had. And by using what we had, we helped advance what was important to God. And what a great day it would be for all of us to hear our coach say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many. Enter into your master's joy." Let's pray together. Father, thank you for this parable of Jesus. This message that is both challenging and inviting for us to hear. And thank you for Glenkirk. God, thank you that we're filled with men and women and children and students that live this way. Father, help us be faithful with what you've entrusted to us. Help us see everything that we have, every resource, as a gift of your grace, something that belongs to you, that you trust us to use for your glory and other people's benefit. And Father, as we finish out this summer and as we look towards the fall, lead and guide us into new visions of what you might have for us, that we might walk in courage and faith and boldness to seek to honor you as your stewards. For we pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.